Sasha Alenko here. I help write and produce the Reconnect America podcast. So railroads, their customers, and their workers are currently lining up their pieces in what will likely be a long, drawn-out battle over the proposed $85 billion merger of Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. For most of these groups, the choice of whether to oppose the merger, support it, or support it on certain conditions is not merely symbolic. The Surface Transportation Board is required by statute to take the interests of workers, shippers, competing railroads, and the public into account as it weighs whether to approve or block the move. Whether the STB will make good on this obligation after the, by all appearances, illegal recent firing of Robert Primus, the only board member to have opposed the most recent merger, remains to be seen. But on top of being a potentially consequential decision, the question of whether to support or oppose the merger can also be a thorny one, especially for the subject of today's conversation, railroad workers. To begin with, railroad workers often find themselves in a difficult position vis-a-vis their employers, by virtue of the fact that they are divided into about a dozen different craft unions. Each union is constantly faced with the question of whether to accept concessions for its own particular constituency, or hold out in the name of all workers and risk being left empty-handed as other unions strike their own deals with the railroads. Beyond these underlying dynamics, a UP-NS merger also introduces even higher stakes, as it could very well result in significant cuts to the workforce, resulting from the elimination of redundant or supposedly redundant facilities. To better understand the dilemmas faced by workers in the fight ahead, and to help us pick apart the smokescreens that UP and NS are promulgating in an effort to charm workers into submission, we got in touch with Ron Kaminkow, a longtime ally and collaborator of Solutionary Rails. Ron is also a co-founder, former general secretary, and current trustee of Railroad Workers United, or RWU, a cross-union caucus of railroad workers that seeks to build industry-wide solidarity to more effectively stand up to Wall Street's railroads. Last month, RWU passed a resolution unequivocally opposing all future Class I railroad mergers. We'll put a link in the show notes. Now, it should be noted that this conversation between Ron and Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer took place before Robert Primus was fired from the Surface Transportation Board. RWU has since released a statement condemning the move and demanding Primus's immediate reinstatement, for which we will also provide a link. What Ron and Bill did discuss was the service meltdowns that Ron witnessed as a railroad worker during the last merger wave in the 1990s, the stakes involved for railroad workers in the fight that lies ahead, and the larger question of whether the coast-to-coast transcontinental railroad that UP and NS are proposing to form might not be a better idea if it were owned and overseen by the public.
Welcome. This is Reconnect America, and I'm Bill Moyer. I'm here with Ron Kaminkow. Ron has been a longtime friend and ally. When Solutionary Rail was in its early formation, it was a conversation with Ron that really helped me crystallize the ideas that Solutionary Rail will be putting forward, and it affirmed some of the initial thoughts around the potential of rail to be a tool for bringing together different sectors of our society and serve as a movement building tool for a kind of populism that I think appeals to the best in people rather than the worst in them, and that makes a material difference in people's lives. At that time, Ron, you were the general secretary of Railroad Workers United, and I would love for you to introduce yourself and share a little bit about how you became someone who works in the railroads, and how Railroad Workers United formed, and maybe where RWU is now. But first, let's start with giving folks a sense of who is Ron Kaminkow.
Well, I hired in with the railroad relatively late in life. I was 36 years old. I hired in with Conrail in Chicago back in the mid-90s, 30 years ago. And I hired in as a brakeman, became a conductor, and then went to engine school in Conway, Pennsylvania. Shortly thereafter, our railroad was, I call it, hijacked by the Norfolk Southern in a big carve up where Conrail was divided more or less equally, half to the Norfolk Southern and half to CSX. So I experienced that so called meltdown firsthand every day I went to work for well over a year. Didn't really like the Norfolk Southern, the way they railroaded. And in 2004, I came to Amtrak. I just spent 20 odd years working for Amtrak as an engineer. During this time, I worked out of Milwaukee as well as Chicago, Elkhart, Indiana, and Reno, Nevada. I've worked over pretty much every Class 1 railroad in the country, partly as a Conrail guy, because in Chicago we interchanged with Santa Fe, Burlington Northern, Union Pacific, etc., and then also as Amtrak because they're the host railroads. And so I've had a wealth of experience. I've railroaded in 9 different states over, like I say, most all the Class 1 railroads for close to 30 years.
At what point did you form the precursor? And then how did Railroad Workers United evolve and become part of your way of serving?
Got it. I was actually working for Amtrak by this time in 2004, and the engineer I was qualifying with came to work through the newspaper on the console of the locomotive and basically said, "This is it, we're screwed." And that's when the rail carriers, through the National Carriers Conference Committee, in their Section 6 notices under the Railway Labor Act, first proposed the idea of single-person crews. We had already seen the recent advent of remote control locomotives in the yard, displacing thousands of good engineer jobs that were now in the hands of UTU, United Transportation Union, represented conductors, driving a huge wedge, once again, between the two craft unions. So our job immediately, and when I say our job, I mean every engineer and every conductor in North America, our job was to make sure that those divisions between those craft unions did not poison us to the point where we ended up with single person crews on through freight over the road. And here we are almost 21 years later, and I'm proud to say that every Class 1 freight train in the country that's going from terminal to terminal over the line of road is still operated with a certified engineer and a certified conductor. So we formed this group, ROCU, Railroad Operating Crafts United. To make a long story short, ROCU morphed into Railroad Workers United, where we invited all the crafts and anybody who worked for the railroad in North America to be part of this organization. And that's pretty much where we are today.
You started, you say, at Conrail. What did the creation of Conrail teach us about the importance of rail transport to the U.S. economy, and also about the priority for railroads to make profit? And if you want to go back further and describe, like, why was Conrail created, that might be helpful to folks. And what the hell is Conrail?
So the big railroads and the standard railroad of the world, I think they like to call themselves, was the Pennsylvania Railroad. This, of course, was 100 years ago. But as other forms of transportation came along and it developed and improved, like highways and air travel, the rail industry and, of course, its Wall Street investors understood that there's more profit to be made elsewhere. The advent of the interstate highway system was not a good thing for the railroads in this country, or for that matter, anywhere else in the world. But there was ways that the railroad could have adapted, I believe, and competed with highways. But the railroads began to divest themselves and basically say, well, this is not where the money is. The money is in other things like hotels and so forth. I remember the steel industry did the same thing and started buying up oil companies and investing overseas and so forth. So they sort of self-sabotage. But to make a long story short, the two titans of the East, the New York Central and the Penn Central, merged curiously in an effort to sort of save themselves. That fell on its face, and which is interesting because we'll get into more modern day mergers over a half a century later, right up until today's Norfolk Southern Union Pacific proposed merger. But that merger fell on its face. Penn Central declared bankruptcy, I believe the biggest in the history of the country, along with the Northeastern, New Haven, Lehigh Valley, the Reading. All of these smaller, weaker roads also went belly up. And that's what created Conrail, because the railroads were, quote, too important to fail. So, as always happens in a sort of capitalist democratic society, the government steps in, bails them out, so to speak, and in this case, actually bought the rail infrastructure and recreated a whole new Northeastern mega railroad called Conrail. And that's who I ended up working for just about 20 years after its formation. And by this point, they'd worked out a lot of kinks. Conrail had become pretty much a super railroad that was very well run. Unfortunately, after putting in billions and billions of dollars of government money, the railroad recovered. And so what did they do? Immediately sold it back to private interests. And it was interesting talking to fellow workers at Conrail who had very much opposed selling the railroad off in the first place back to Wall Street. But that's what happened. And then a short time thereafter, 96, it all got proposed, but by 99, it was split in half. And that was the end of Conrail for the most part. And it was completely gobbled up by the Class 1 railroads that it once was owned by.
Right. And if I'm not mistaken, this was after labor had tried to actually purchase Conrail themselves.
I believe there was a bid by the workforce to buy Conrail. Really quite tragic. Had they succeeded, it could have set a model example of how a railroad could be run by the people who actually run the railroad, so to speak. Maybe that's one reason that they did not get the railroad, simply because we don't want those kind of examples. Well, I say we, I should say Wall Street and the ruling rich of this country don't want those kind of examples, because they would inspire working people to form other types of cooperatives and worker ownership.
Right. And this wouldn't be the first time that that sort of initiative was rejected. When we looked at the history of Amtrak, or the history of passenger rail and the formation of Amtrak, it seemed to be similarly in response to this failure of the Penn Central, that consolidation to actually save that railroad, and that Conrail was just another intervention. But both interventions did what the ICC would not allow the railroads to do themselves, which was to reduce the amount of track, to abandon some service. And like for Amtrak, we lost basically half of the passenger service in the nation when it became Amtrak. And it seems that we lost a considerable amount of the connectivity of the private rail system when it became Conrail. How do you interpret that? Was that a necessary rationalization of the system or something else?
I mean, and we've seen this in the auto industry and lots of other places, that when these industries fail, which is to say they have certain obligations that they can't really financially meet under a for-profit system, I mean, the government has various opportunities, and one would be let them fail, understanding and knowing that when they do, for example, there would be no passenger train service or very, very limited, and that would be a hardship to millions of American people. Or in the case of Penn Central, let it fail, but you would also see hundreds of trackside industries either switch to shipping by road or go out of business. Once again, a huge hardship and a cost to society. So the government has another option, which is to step in and, quote, save them. And they can do that by subsidizing them, which is never very politically palatable. And then there's yet another option, which is to create a quasi-government or government-run corporation like Amtrak or Conrail. And of course, Amtrak came along 71. 5 years later, we saw Conrail. It's hard to say if these crises took place today, exactly what the government's response would be. But they were sort of Band-Aid solutions. As you pointed out, we lost half the passenger service when Amtrak was created. It's been a bit of a basket case for 50 years, and I can say that having worked for it for 20 odd years. Same thing with Conrail. Conrail was by no means perfect, because what Conrail was able to do is abandon huge swaths of track. That was the end of the Erie-Lackawanna beautiful main line across Ohio and Indiana. It doesn't exist anymore. It was a CTC, fairly high-speed railroad. When I say high speed, don't confuse that with the term today. But for a freight carrier going across the Midwest, it was in actually very good shape. It was abandoned and torn up. It's gone forever, as were many of the main lines of the Lehigh Valley, the Reading, and so forth, and even secondary mains of the Pennsylvania and New York Central. So we lost a lot to sort of regain, if you will, the profitability, quote unquote, of Conrail. So yeah, while these were, quote, solutions, they were hardly the perfect solution that we really wanted in terms of a robust freight and passenger rail system in the Northeast and throughout the country.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the Staggers Act and what that then made possible for not just Conrail, but for others railroads in terms of allowing for abandonment or the reduction of service to communities or particular industries or commodities. Could you describe how you see railroads' engagement with shippers changing after Staggers, after the deregulation?
It seems like there was a time, and this probably was sort of the culture that developed over generations. Once the railroads became regulated, there was just a basic understanding on the railroad that you treated customers the way any business would treat customers, and that's with respect, and that's with the desire to make them happy and so forth. I mean, even into my early days railroading in the 90s, there was this idea that you ran the passenger train on time to the extent possible. That's all gone out the window, basically. As far as the way freight customers are treated, I think things really went downhill about the time I was leaving the freight industry 20 years or so ago. And I think that was like just a gradual realization by the carriers, particularly as they became more and more monopolized. So we had roughly 40 Class 1 railroads in 1980, but by the time of the Conrail carve up, I think then we were down to 7. So it's been about 7 Class 1s in the last 25 years. Now 6, apparently soon to be 5, unless we stop it, but we'll get to that later in the discussion. So I think that helped embolden railroad management to just realize we don't have to treat our customers very well anymore. And it's literally our way or the highway. If you don't like the price, if you don't like the lack of service, if you don't like the fact that you used to get 5 switches a week and now you're down to 3 or 2 or 1, if you don't like the fact that the switch would show up in the afternoon, but now it could show up anytime, and it's not your prerogative to say when, it's ours if we show up at all, because we're running a skeletal workforce where switch crews die on the law, expire on 12-hour hours of service law, and we just don't get to your plant today. And we may not get to it tomorrow. Oh, and we're going to charge you demurrage charges on the fleet of cars that you have on your property because they are just sitting there and not being used for more than 48 hours or whatever the basis is. And so it's not surprising that shipping groups over the last few decades, in particular in the last few years, have been up in arms, complaining to the Surface Transportation Board vociferously about the lack of service that they are getting. And things got so bad 2 or 3 years ago, the railroad was even embargoing traffic, even for some of their big customers. And the railroad has often treated its little customers very poorly. If you want to ship a boxcar a week, that's not a whole lot of money. And in many cases, they drive you off because they'd rather you actually ship by highway, because the railroad wants 30 or 40 or even 50 cents on the dollar. And so even though it's profitable to ship your boxcar once a week, it's actually dragging up the operating ratio all in all because it's not profitable enough. So yeah, they just as soon get rid of you. And this is what we've seen. And so it's no surprise that in 2006, we moved way more freight traffic, 32.1 million carloads, than we have in any year since. And in 2023, I think it was probably the lowest it got into the toilet, with 25.4 million carloads, which is a reduction of about 24%. Now, what industry that continually makes record profits with record low operating ratios is able to do that by moving only 76% of what it formerly did 15 years earlier. There's huge monopoly forces at play here. And so, obviously, in response to your question, Bill, all of this combines to create a mindset amongst everyone from the CEO on down to the smallest terminal train master on the ground. We don't really care what the industry cares about. We don't worry about providing good service because they pretty much have to stay with us because we're the only show in town. And if they're capable of switching to the highway, let them if that's what they want. And in many cases, we just don't care. And this is the state of freight rail industry today in the United States.
So pre-consolidation, if I'm understanding this properly, when there were many more railroads and the rates were set because it was highly regulated for trucking and for rail shipping, you were competing on price. You were competing on service. So if you have that system in place for decades and decades, one can see how the word culture, as you brought up, gets established where there's a culture of service. It might take a while when those controls, when those regulations go away, when the competition disappears, there might be a bit of a lag before the railroads realize they can get away with anything. But you get that gradual shift in the culture of the industry. Is that an accurate way to portray what has happened?
I think so,
Okay.
but not really having the time to study it because I've been working for the railroad and also not being in management, it's very hard for me and my coworkers to decipher exactly what's going on out there on the property. But listening to what your coworkers have to say, being involved in Railroad Workers United and talking to freight railroaders from all the different class ones around the country and trying to make some sense in the last 20 years of what the hell is really going on in the industry, it's a huge kettle of fish to be sure.
Yeah, as we start to try to understand this very convoluted history, I'm starting to have an emergent theory that rail has actually never been, in and of itself, a profitable industry if it's simultaneously serving its mission to the society of providing adequate service. It required land grants. There were all kinds of stock manipulation that happened early on. The Interstate Commerce Commission saved it from eating its own with what some call ruinous competition. Then World War One, where the government had to come in and take over to standardize and make the system work to support the war effort. As you've said, like the creation of Amtrak, the creation of Conrail, consolidation after consolidation to try to squeeze more profit out of the same system or reduce that system. It seems like a constant trajectory or a history of interventions of one sort or another in order to try to squeeze more profit out of a system that maybe should not be being asked to make a profit in the first place. So here we are. We've gone from hundreds of railroads 100 years ago. And now, like you said, we have 6 or possibly 5. We're at the very tail end of a process that's been going on for 150 years. So this moment when the Union Pacific is attempting to merge with Norfolk Southern is a pretty important moment. And so I'm very interested to hear your reflections about this particular moment and this final stage of attempting to limit access to the system as a way of squeezing more profit out of the system.
Well, interestingly, a few months ago, I happened to stumble upon an article, and some Wall Street outfit was stating that they're becoming disillusioned with the Class 1 railroads in this country. And surprisingly, they said car loadings have been flat for more than a decade now. And that was putting it mildly because, as I just mentioned, car loadings aren't flat. They've actually in the toilet, relatively speaking. And so it was interesting to see maybe Wall Street catching on to this, that this is not sustainable. The operating ratios were plunging, but that has come to a screeching halt. But there was a while when Union Pacific was actually stating our goal now is a 0.50 operating ratio, which is 50 cents on the dollar, which is sort of unheard of. And you don't see that in many other, if any other industries in the country, especially not in trucking. But that was the goal. And that sort of has slowed and maybe reversed now. And so Wall Street's concerned, and they cage it up in terms of car loadings are flat, which of course we've been pointing out now and beating the
Right.
drum that this industry can't really be successful if it's doing less of what it's supposed to be doing, even if it's making record profits and has low operating ratios. So Wall Street catching on to this. And so if your goal is to increase car loadings and you're a railroad, let's see, how can we do that? Well, the railroad is sort of congested, so let's extend our sidings so all the trains that are now very lengthy can fit in them and expedite our service. Let's consider double tracking where the potential for that frequency of rail movements warrants. We can upgrade signal systems or install signals in dark territory where there are no signals. We can rebuild or expand smaller yards or even some of our bigger ones. There's lots and lots of things you can do. You can reduce your rates to some of your customers. You can develop a marketing department and literally go door to door and try to drum up traffic. That's gone by the wayside decades ago now. So in other words, there's lots of things that the rail industry could do and individual rail companies could do to bring back more traffic. There's a problem though. All of that I just said costs money. You have to make investments in labor, you have to make investments in infrastructure and so forth. And Wall Street doesn't want that. So what's the solution? Merge. It seems like this is always the solution that they have come up with over the last 100 years. But once again, it does kick the can down the road. I would suspect that a Norfolk Southern Union Pacific merger probably will not result in a whole lot more car loadings, maybe not any. One could actually postulate it could result in reduced car loadings. But that's not the object of the exercise. The object of the exercise, according to the wealthy who own the railroads, is to keep that operating ratio lowering and keep those profits, so hence the stock buybacks, rolling in. And so that's what the UP-NS merger is all about. And that's why Railroad Workers United, and of course, lots of shipping groups and passenger rail advocacy groups and others have extreme concerns about the future of the industry. And let's face it, if this merger is successful, and even before it has been approved, it would not be surprising if BNSF and CSX, and that could literally be coming in the coming weeks, we don't know,
Right.
but they
Any
would
day.
tacitly have to merge. And then we would be left with two US-based transcontinental Class 1 railroads. And not only would this industry be pared down to just 4 Class 1s handling 90% of the rail freight in this country, it would be the only transportation infrastructure that doesn't just own the industry, but they actually own the track, they own the yards, they own the buildings and bridges, they actually own the infrastructure. And not only in the United States, it will be Canada, Mexico, and the United States. These 4 Class 1 railroads will own the rail infrastructure and the rail industry for all intents and purposes in the entire continent. And we need to ask ourselves, as theoretically a democratic people, if we think this is a good idea.
Right. And you could take that yet another step and say the owners are actually Wall Street, and they're like the large investment firms like Vanguard or others, BlackRock. They own significant portions of at least more than one of those railroads. So potentially the ownership remains even more concentrated, and it's concentrated in Wall Street with shareholders who, with the exception of this one analyst who was kind of pointing out the fact that, oh, maybe this isn't a sustainable business model, that they're just milking the shit out of this system for short-term gain. They love the stock buybacks. The stock buybacks are an artificial reward to keep Wall Street fascinated by managers who are rewarded when they reduce service. So it's a pretty pivotal moment right now. And so it's really, as usual, fantastic that RWU is out there at the vanguard of this thing, helping people see this moment clearly. And so, do you mind if we go through the RWU resolution and look at the way that it's set up, how it's structured in order to raise the alarm and call bullshit on this idea that this is somehow going to return service to our country by creating this true transcontinental railroad? Shall we go with that?
Yeah, sure. And, at some point, Bill, before we sign off, I want to specifically speak to railroad workers as to why this merger is not in their interest. I just got a text today that said some of the young guys, they actually are saying the merger would be good because they assume they'll get some sort of a raise or a bonus or something. And this could be the case that to buy labor support, they simply come out with some little gimmickry thing that every worker on day one of the merger will get $25,000. So
Right.
it's like candy. It could be very
Yeah.
alluring, but I would love to spell out specifically why it will be bad for us.
Well, hey, why don't we just do that? I mean, we might as well do that right now.
Okay. All right.
So
So
you're
last
saying
week,
that through this consolidation, they're trying to bait railroad workers into supporting this so that labor will be divided and won't be able to strongly oppose the merger. We've heard, for instance, that no one will lose their job. And now you're saying they're actually offering bonuses?
no, Bill, I'm just saying that this is a possibility. The rumors are going to fly. And,
Sure.
UPNS may float all sorts of ideas to confuse the workforce, potentially make it clear that certain crafts will be unharmed while others might be. And so then we get the usual nonsense of some of the rail unions maybe supporting it, some are neutral, and some oppose it, which kind of cancels out rail labor's voice, so to speak. So, yeah, one of the many reasons Railroad Workers United exists is because at times like this, rail labor needs a united voice. And the adage of rail labor is an injury to one is an injury to all. And if the shop crafts, for example, stand to take it in the shorts from this merger, if they were all in our unions, which is to say the operating craft unions, we would have solidarity with them and say, well, look, this is not going to be fair to 40% of our members, and so we're opposed to it. But since they're in a different union, that's their fight to fight alone. I mean, this is scabbery. You can call it whatever you want, but it's scabbery by any other name because it's workers working in the same industry for the same corporation, literally whose contracts, wages, benefits, working conditions are somewhat predicated upon the health of their fellow workers, regardless of craft or union affiliation. And we should never say that's their fight to fight alone. We should never say, we're going to make out okay, so therefore we vote to support it. And if you don't think it's in your interest, you can vote to oppose it, but don't tell us what to do. This is a horrible, horrible model of trade unionism. And in fact, it was archaic 150 years ago, basically, and we're still saddled with it. And so Railroad Workers United has come out unequivocally opposed to the merger. If this, that, or the other craft might theoretically benefit, which of course is a kiss and a promise, or if this, that, or the other terminal or group of workers might benefit from the Norfolk Southern Union Pacific proposed merger, to us, that is irrelevant. We understand that for the majority, over time, the big picture, this merger is not in the interest of railroad workers. And therefore, we adopted a resolution and have sent out a press release explaining to the American people why this Norfolk Southern Union Pacific combination is not in our interest, not just as railroad workers, but also as shippers, passenger rail advocates, environmentalists, trackside communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as a railroad workers organization, we have specific concerns, of course, for our specific constituency, which is railroad workers, particularly working railroad workers, although retirees are also our concern. First and foremost, right out of the box, if there is a merger of this nature, given what we know about previous mergers in recent years, particularly the Union Pacific takeover of Southern Pacific in 1995, resulted in a huge service disruption and meltdown where the newly merged railroad simply could not manage the combined system and service failures all over the place. And this lasted, I think, upwards of a year.
Wow.
In 99, the railroad I was working for, Conrail, was split in half. And on the Norfolk Southern side, which is where I happened to work, on day one, we experienced a severe shock wave. The computer systems did not combine and work properly together. I don't really understand how that happened, but they lost every car in the system. And it took about 18 months to recover. The railroad was completely constipated on the west end into Chicago, where our two-track main line, which was a very, very modern and relatively sophisticated main line in terms of signaling and crossovers and ability to move on either track in either direction at any time, may have had anywhere from 5 to 10 trains that were tied down and parked between Elkhart and Chicago every day. And it was not uncommon to work 12 hours plus every day for days and days and days, weeks at a time. My personal record was I moved a train from Coal Yard at milepost 510 to the bridge at CP 509. That's a grand total of 1 mile. I did that with my conductor in a 12-hour tour of duty. This is how backed up the railroad was. And so with these sorts of inefficiencies, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of carloads were driven off the Norfolk Southern. I assume some went to CSX. Others that could went to truck. And maybe some firms actually went out of business. But it was an unmitigated disaster. And for the workforce, it's incredibly demoralizing. One, you're exhausted. Two, when you go to work, you have been inculcated with this idea that your job is to move freight and make things happen. And you're proud of the job that you do. And you understand its intrinsic value to society and all these other warm and fuzzy things. And now you can't even feel that because it's a mess. Nothing works. Every day is a crisis. In addition, I would postulate that this becomes a dangerous workplace environment. Whenever workers are demoralized, they don't necessarily face a safe working condition. When things are backed up and inefficient, there's an emphasis by management to unconstipate the railroad, which is get this train out of this yard. We got another one coming in. And so there's this huge tendency to cut corners, to cut maintenance, cut inspection, because we got to get this railroad unconstipated. And so I think this is just objectively fact. It will not be a safe work environment if we have a meltdown. And history seems to show that these large recent mergers have a terrible record when it comes to having an easy transition to an amalgamated railroad. And this is going to be twice as big as anything that's come before it. And if you look at the amalgamation proposed map, you have huge terminals that are already congested. Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, Memphis, and New Orleans are all points where these two railroads will intersect. And so the potential for a calamity looms large in my mind after railroading for 30 years and in the minds of every other railroad worker who has ever been involved firsthand in one of these mega merger combinations. And so that's the first thing that railroad workers have to have huge concerns about. You're going to be fatigued, you're going to be overworked, you're going to watch your railroad go into the toilet. Every day will be a day of frustration and it's not going to be a particularly healthy and safe workplace environment. So that's the first thing that railroad workers need to really understand is a distinct possibility. The second thing that railroaders need to be concerned about is this whole question of consolidation. Where do these magical economies come from when two large corporations combine? Well, often they come from, and they'll admit this, but not, full bore right in front of your face and tell you the gory details. But these efficiencies arise from elimination of what would they call duplicate resources
Like
or
redundant.
duplicate infrastructure.
Yeah.
You're redundant.
Yeah.
So let's take Chicago, which is a city I know fairly well from railroading, but you could probably extrapolate to Kansas City or St. Louis, New Orleans, etc. Union Pacific will have, no doubt, a diesel facility, a car maintenance shop. It will have freight pools in the T&E, so train and engine side. Of course, you're at the end of the railroad, so they only go one way, one direction. Norfolk Southern on the east end will have its diesel shops, its car shops, its classification yards. You get the picture, but they're literally within miles of each other. And so now you have a railroad where lots of stuff is going to go through New Orleans and through Chicago. And so there'll be a tendency, naturally, for the railroads to say, let's downgrade one of those facilities or even close it entirely. And so to think that railroaders are not going to be displaced, if you have seniority, 10, 20, 30 years maybe, and your diesel shop closes, you may be able to exercise your seniority across town and get a job at the formerly other railroad's facility. That could uproot your family, uproot your life, and you would go at the bottom of the list, the combined list, because all these questions of how the seniority is going to work have to be dealt with. The worst case scenario is you have 2, 3, 5 years on the railroad and you just outright lose your job. The railroad, of course, is not going to come out and say that this is what we're going to do.
Right.
But the unions have to be extremely careful about accepting verbal promises, and they don't have a very good track record at this. They should never accept a verbal promise. You don't go to the bargaining table and negotiate a contract and accept a verbal promise in the room. You have a signed contract in writing, and the railroad or the union should settle for nothing less than this. But even then, we know contracts could be written extremely vaguely and be subject to arbitration, and the railroad could still get away with a massive job dislocation over the years. And remember, this would not be the effect immediately. It may take a little while for the railroad to decide, okay, this diesel shop is going to be shut down, or this one's going to be downgraded. So the ripple effect could take place over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years, literally.
I mean, aren't they selling this as this is the transcontinental railroad? We will not have to stop in Chicago and switch trains. So if they're not stopping in Chicago to switch trains, that really does raise some serious questions for what people are thinking are going to happen to those shops. I thought that's the whole point, is that you're going to you're going to hit Chicago, or you're going to bypass Chicago and you're going to keep going. So that's got to affect the system. That can't not affect the system. It seems like it's the plan. The plan is to affect the system. The plan is to change the system.
Exactly. And in some ways, an argument can be made, and I wouldn't totally disagree with it, that having trains bypass Chicago or having freight not to be classified, or even worse, drayaged by truck across crowded city streets in Chicago from the west side to the east side to continue on its journey to Jersey, these are great efficiencies. And if, in fact, they came to pass, this would be efficient for the railroad and be profitable. And this is where the railroad is totally disingenuous, because they will say, see, this will be good for labor because now we're making all this profit. Things are so efficient. We'll get trucks off the highway and that'll create more jobs. But if we look at what the rail industry has done the last 30 years, no, with those profits, they don't win traffic off the highway. They don't even attempt to. In fact, they're so busy paying out dividends and luring high-priced CEOs and buying back stock that even though that operating ratio dropped over the last 20 years, car loadings didn't increase, which one would have expected if the railroad was to be believed. And so while these efficiencies may take place in terms of having a transcontinental railroad and bypassing congested terminals like Chicago, it's very unlikely that railroad workers are going to reap those benefits. And I would postulate it's incredibly naive for our unions or any rank and file worker to think that this is going to translate into lots more car loadings and more jobs for my cousin, my brother, my son, my daughter, etc. It's just not going to happen. So that's part two, the consolidation. So we've talked about the meltdown immediately, the consolidation and job loss, etc., and seniority loss. And last but not least is just this simple question of the rail industry has been consolidating over the last 100 years. And now we're going to be down to just 4, with just 2 of them being true US-based mass transcontinentals, because CN and CP have limited holdings in the United States. So we're kind of going to whittle the whole thing down to 2 big class 1 transcontinentals, because as I mentioned, BNSF and CSX will invariably merge in the process.
Just to insert a much more recent number is there were more than 40 class 1 railroads in 1980. And now we're talking about going down to 2 US class 1 railroads if this is allowed to go forward.
Correct. And so is it in the interest of railroad workers to sit across the bargaining table or in the halls of legislatures around this country, including the federal government? Is it in railroad workers and our unions' interest to have our class enemy, if you will, our adversary, our opponent at the bargaining table? Is it in our interest to have them so consolidated and so united and so powerful? I would say hell no. And tragically, if you look at rail labor, and we have pared down, I think there was as many as 24 rail unions at one point. Many have passed out of existence or merged, but we still have 12 odd railroad unions on the railroad. We are divided and in effect conquered by these huge class 1 railroads who keep combining and getting more and more and more consolidated and more powerful. That cannot be good for railroad labor or our unions going forward into the future. So just to recap, 3 reasons why railroad workers should oppose this merger: the huge prospect for a meltdown, the huge prospect for job consolidation combination, the loss of seniority and the loss of employment, and then last but not least, the fact that our opponents are going to become more and more powerful and more of a monopoly.
Yeah. And it's not just clearly bad for workers. It's, and as you pointed out, increasing the profit of the railroad companies does not get passed to the workers. Consolidation also does not translate into better service for shippers, for industry, for communities. All this talk of reshoring, et cetera, the loss of carload service that you've described, that's all happened when railroads were consolidated and were making ridiculous profits. So the idea that they're baiting shippers into supporting this by saying, oh, we're going to be able to, speed up your service, we're going to be able to add more carloads, et cetera, et cetera. Why would we even believe that? There's no evidence that their consolidation delivers better service in the past. So why should their consolidation deliver better service now?
Well, yeah, good point, Bill. We believe all sorts of things that I'm constantly amazed by. I'm not free from it myself. We are brought up from the time we are a toddler to believe in a lot of what I would call mythology about things like laissez-faire capitalism and free enterprise and all of these sort of pipe dreams that, well, a company that treats its workers poorly would invariably go out of business because workers would not work for a company that treats them poorly. And so the law of supply and demand, et cetera, comes into play. And it's this panacea. And somewhere in the back of our minds, all of us, lurks this shit, this stuff, because we have been weaned on it for years. And so when the railroad industry says something to us like, see, it's an end-to-end merger, and now we can ship a carload from the West Coast to the East Coast on a transcontinental railroad. Wow, that just sounds great. And that's got to
I
have
want to get
all
up,
these
but yeah,
benefits to society, to the workforce, to the environment, to the shippers, and everyone's going to be happy. But that's just a theory. But we know from looking at previous mergers that we've just talked about, this often isn't the case. In fact, probably never is the case when there's a merger that all these wonderful things take place.
when there's a merger that is controlled by entities that are principally propelled by the compunction to create greater and greater profit, allowing the monopolies, the duopolies, the oligarchs to then build yet further power, to further hold us all captive because of their power over this critical national infrastructure, to act like cartels that don't need to compete with each other because they've got everybody by the balls already. Those sorts of consolidations are not going to help us. But like you said, the idea of being able to bypass Chicago or to overcome and undo bottlenecks, it's not like that's a terrible thing if the objective was better service. But the objective is not better service. The objective is not long-term growth and resilience of the industry. The objective is profit.
Exactly. And, this leads us back to the mythology that, what's good for General Motors is good for the United States of America was a very popular slogan in the 1950s. And that is sort of emblematic of this whole ideology. What's good for business is good for everybody. And if business benefits and is profitable, it will invariably, quote, trickle down, as in Reagan's trickle-down theory of economics that I don't think worked very well because you can trace the disparity of wealth starts to grow and separate around the time Reagan came to office and has continued to this day. So it's somewhat nonsensical. But let's get back to the efficiencies of a transcontinental railroad. First of all, as a former co-chair of Railroad Workers United, who's a Union Pacific engineer, pointed out to me the other day, we have a transcontinental railroad. It's there. It's just cut into these different companies. So it's kind of curious to use that terminology, a transcontinental railroad. The infrastructure is there. You theoretically could run a train tomorrow, stopping for crew changes from LA to the Jersey Shore, 3,000 miles, except for this problem called corporations who have owned different chunks of it. But if we look at what you referenced earlier, the Plum Plan was an idea that came out of World War I when the nation's railroads were briefly nationalized. And I think one of the beauties of the Plum Plan is it called for a tripartite management of the railroad system, which would, of course, be transcontinental. We could have had a true transcontinental, singly managed system 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, had the legislation succeeded in Congress and been signed into law. So I believe the board of directors called for a board of 24 individuals. A third of those, which is to say 8, would be representatives of the workforce through the unions. A third of them would be professional railroad managers. And a third would be, quote, government officials. And the way I read that third, representatives of shippers associations, passenger rail advocates, trackside communities, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, everyone who has a stake in the operation of the railroad, together with professional managers of the railroad, would manage this thing. And then, Bill, your concern about the railroad being operated strictly from a motivation of profit would be removed. And all of the different interest groups that ride the railroad, live by the railroad, have communities dependent on the railroad, and last but not least, the workforce that works on the railroad would all be represented. And so then we would have a much more democratic operation of the railroad where everybody who's interested in the success of that railroad would have a stake. And that's not what we have today. And so unfortunately, these so-called great efficiencies that would result from a first truly transcontinental railroad won't be realized.
Right. Now, the Plum Plan and Public Rail Now, the work done by Maddock Thomas and others have brought new energy towards this idea of a publicly owned rail system. The Plum Plan, as you describes a railroad where the train operations are also owned and controlled by this national railroad. What is totally clear and I think obvious to me and a lot of people I talk to is that when you have the airports controlled and managed by the public, and you've got the freeways owned and maintained by the public, and you've got the national waterways owned and maintained by the public, what the hell is going on? And what your resolution and your story and this threat of a merger raise as a really important possibility and something that should be a platform for all of us to be finding common cause in is that this critical national infrastructure needs to be public infrastructure. It needs to be not controlled and drained of its value in order to concentrate power on Wall Street. It needs to be marshaled in order to serve communities and to serve our society. What do you see as the next steps in moving forward the idea of building a coalition for a public ownership in some way, shape, or form of this critical national infrastructure?
Well, two things are at play here. One is building a coalition opposed to the Union Pacific Norfolk Southern merger. As far as building a coalition to support public ownership of the railroad, while there's definitely some interface there, considering things like the National Industrial Transportation League, they're not probably going to get on board with public ownership. Although at some point, if service deteriorates to the point that it might, they could potentially come on board. But at this point, building that coalition is going to be a slightly different looking coalition than the immediate one that Railroad Workers United hopes to see emerge, which is the majority of the basic shipping associations come out unequivocally, we're opposed. We want to try to get all of the unions on board to not just express concerns, but to say we're opposed to it. At this point, I believe there's just one union, the Transportation Workers Union, TWU, has come out forcefully opposed to the merger. The handful of other rail unions have said they express concerns, which is always a little dangerous because, in effect, what they're saying is, show us what's in it for us and our members, even with a kiss and a promise, and we might be neutral, or even better for you, we could come out publicly in favor, which for us is a disaster because then you have half of rail labor saying yes, half of rail labor saying no, and we don't want to see that situation. So we will be beating the bushes inside of our specific craft unions, and hopefully RWU's forthright position opposed to the merger will inspire rank and filers in all the different crafts to say, yeah, those guys got it right. I want to see my union, whether it's IBEW, IAM, BRS, or whatever, come out and say the same thing, no merger. We're going to be talking to our friends in the environmental community. I have a big list of folks that we aim to contact and ask them to get on board, as there's big reasons. And we've worked with environmental groups in the past, of course, Bill, as you know, on the whole question of rail safety and so forth. And so same with the rail passengers. The big associations have voiced concerns. They have not, I don't think, come out unequivocally opposed to the merger at this point. I will be speaking at the Rail Users Network conference in November, it looks like, where there will be a seminar on the whole question of the UP-NS merger. So yeah, whether or not we're successful in A, building the coalition, let alone B, defeating the UP-NS merger, I would make this case to my brothers and sisters on the railroad. Whether or not you think we can stop this merger, whether or not big business and corporate America cannot be defeated is beside the point. If you don't fight, you'll never win, number one. But in the course of the fight, you build the alliance, the coalition, the consciousness, the awareness of the issues, so you might be in a better position to win the next fight. And last but not least, in building this coalition and making this effort to defeat the UP-NS merger, it gives us the opportunity to blow the whistle on the real nature of the rail industry in this country. So even if we lose the fight, we have enlightened and educated the American public more about the whole issue of stock buybacks, the lack of maintenance, the lack of inspection, the failure to invest hundreds of billions of dollars accrued to the railroad in recent decades hasn't gone into double tracking, better signaling, higher speeds, lengthened sidings, or anything else. In fact, they have actually reduced the physical plant in this country through abandonments of shops, other infrastructure, secondary main lines and branches, and so forth. And so we get to talk about all of this. And so therefore, the whole merger offers all of us the opportunity to talk to the press, to get our views out there, not just about what's wrong with the U.S. rail industry, but ways to fix it. And that's when we can start talking about things that I just mentioned that need to be done in terms of infrastructure development and broach the question of public ownership.
And the electrification of rail yards and the electrification of main lines and dedicated passenger track. I think that things like the All Aboard Act by Senator Markey is another way, to use resources like that to add to the conversation, to say what we want instead, not just what's wrong with this, but let's also talk about what we want instead and what they failed to deliver. So anyway, Ron, thank you for your strategic perspective, your incredible insights, and spending time with us. We really appreciate you. I really appreciate you. And thank you for being a mentor and a friend to me and Solutionary Rail, and for being on Reconnect America. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Bill. Always a pleasure talking with you.
Cool. Take care.
All right. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.
That was Railroad Workers United co-founder and trustee Ron Kaminkow in conversation with Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. You can find the show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.